Nós, estudantes de Relações Internacionais da PUC-São Paulo e integrantes do Grupo de Estudo de Conflitos Internacionais, firmamos uma parceria com Democracy Now!
A partir de agora, vincularemos com legendas em português as mais importantes notícias internacionais da semana.
From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
THAAD system, $13 billion. The C-130 airplanes, the Hercules, great plane, $3.8 billion. The Bradley vehicles, that's the tanks, $1.2 billion. And the P-8 Poseidons, $1.4 billion.
Meet America's #1 weapons salesman, Donald Trump. We'll look at how the president is personally intervening on behalf of Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon to push U.S.-made weapons across the globe and loosening the rules to allow for greater arms exports. Plus, we'll look at how a bipartisan Senate bill may expand the authority of President Trump and all future presidents to engage in worldwide war without limit. Then we go to Detroit, where a young pregnant African-American activist has been jailed for brandishing a gun to defend her mother and young child. Although no shots were fired, Suwatu Salamara has been sentenced to 2 years in prison.
Something that we're fighting against is the way the world views what Black fear looks like. I think that if I was somebody else, maybe, just maybe, they would have identified with when I said I was afraid.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. President Trump has confirmed that CIA Director Mike Pompeo held a clandestine meeting with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un in Pyongyang on Easter 2 weeks ago. The secret meeting came as President Trump and Kim Jong-un are preparing for a possible face-to-face meeting, which would be the first time a sitting U.S. president has met with a North Korean leader. Mike Pompeo is President Trump's nominee to replace Rex Tillerson as Secretary of State. Critics are asking why the CIA director was chosen to carry out the clandestine talks and whether the leaking of the story is related to the increasing resistance of his confirmation from lawmakers on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee to be Secretary of State. Connecticut Democratic Senator Chris Murphy, Connecticut Republican Senator Rand Paul, Virginia Democratic Senator Tim Kaine, and New Hampshire Democratic Senator Jeanne Shaheen have all said they will vote against recommending Pompeo to the full Senate. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell could still bring Pompeo's confirmation vote to the Senate floor, although it would be the first time for a Secretary of State nominee to fail to be recommended by the committee since 1925. The New York Times is reporting President Trump launched airstrikes against Syria Friday despite opposition from his own defense secretary, James Mattis, who wanted Trump to first get congressional approval. Trump has faced backlash from lawmakers who have described the strikes on Syria as illegal, since Trump did not seek congressional input or authorization. This comes as Congress is considering rewriting the war powers granted to the president after the September 11th attacks, what's known as the AUMF, or Authorization for Use of Military Force. On Monday, Senate Foreign Relations Committee Chair Bob Corker, a Tennessee Republican and Democratic committee member, Senator Tim Kaine of Virginia, introduced legislation to replace the AUMFs with a new one. Critics warn the proposed legislation would actually expand the authority of President Trump and all future presidents to engage in worldwide war without limitations. We'll have more on this after headlines. U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Nikki Haley has launched a public rebuke of the White House after National Economics Advisor, the former CNBC host Larry Kudlow, tried to claim Haley had been confused when she announced the U.S. would impose new sanctions against Russian companies linked to Syria's chemical weapons program. This is Haley speaking on CBS on Sunday.
So you will see that Russian sanctions will be coming down. Secretary Mnuchin will be announcing those on Monday, if he hasn't already, and they will go directly to any sort of companies that were dealing with equipment related to Assad and chemical weapons use.
But then on Monday, the White House said the U.S. would not impose the new sanctions, contradicting Haley's comments one day earlier. On Tuesday, after National Economics Advisor Larry Kudlow tried to claim the reversal had been her error, Haley hit back, telling Fox News in a statement, quote, "With all due respect, I don't get confused." In a victory for the immigrant rights movements, the Supreme Court has struck down a law requiring the mandatory deportation of lawful permanent residents who are convicted of some crimes, saying the law was unconstitutionally vague. Trump appointee Neil Gorsuch sided with the liberal justices, writing, "Vague laws invite arbitrary power." The case centered on a Filipino man named James Garcia de Maya, who'd been a lawful permanent resident of the United States since 1992. After being convicted of residential burglary, the Obama administration sought to deport him for having committed an aggravated felony under the Immigration and Nationality Act. Tuesday's Supreme Court ruling will mean that lower-level offenses are less likely to trigger the automatic deportation of lawful permanent residents. In Cuba, the National Assembly is meeting today to elect a successor for President Raul Castro, who's announced he's stepping down this week. The Assembly is widely expected to choose current Vice President Miguel Díaz-Canel to be Cuba's next leader. Raul Castro is the younger brother of Fidel Castro, who led Cuba for decades following the 1959 revolution. The transition will mark the first time in more than 6 decades that Cuba will be led by someone outside the Castro family. Starbucks says it'll close more than 8,000 stores nationwide for a one-day anti-racial bias training in response to protests and boycott threats after 2 black men were arrested inside a Philadelphia Starbucks. Their lawyer says the 2 men were waiting for a third person to arrive for a business meeting when a Starbucks employee called the police and claimed the men were trespassing. After a video of the arrests went viral, protesters took over the store in downtown Philadelphia during 2 straight days of protests. In New York City, authorities have removed a statue from Central Park of 19th-century gynecologist J. Marion Sims, known as the father of gynecology, who repeatedly performed painful, non-consensual scientific experiments on enslaved black women without anesthesia. The removal of the statue comes after repeated protests last year amidst a nationwide wave of demonstrations against Confederate monuments and other racist statues. This is author Harriet Washington speaking on Democracy Now! About J. Marion Sims back in 2007 when she released her book, Medical Apartheid.
He bought and otherwise acquired a group of black women who he housed in a laboratory, and over the period of 5 years and approximately 40 surgeries on one slave alone, he sought to cure a devastating complication of childbirth called vesicovaginal fistula. This cure entailed repeatedly doing incisions on their genitalia. Very painful and, very emotionally difficult, as you can imagine. And in the end, he claims to have cured one of them.
New York City says it will relocate the statue to a cemetery in Brooklyn where Sims is buried. Meanwhile, activists and educators are organizing to raise money to erect a monument in Chicago to celebrate famed journalist, abolitionist, and suffragist Ida B. Wells. People have already donated tens of thousands of dollars to the fundraising effort, which was launched by Ida B. Wells' great-granddaughter, Michelle Duster. Graduate students nationwide are ramping up demands for the right to form a union. At Northeastern University in Boston, about 100 graduate students and their supporters marched Tuesday to demand the university allow them to hold a union election. This is PhD student Alicia Verticelli.
People on this and many campuses across the country fighting for justice and rights, from dining hall workers to adjuncts to student workers. We are strong because we are many. We are here and we won't be gone until we get our dignity and respect. Thank you.
Students at Harvard University are scheduled to begin voting on unionization today, and New York Columbia University's Graduate Student Union has announced plans to go on strike next week unless the university agrees to negotiate a contract, which it has refused to do for more than a year. The right of graduate students to unionize could be under threat after the U.S. Senate confirmed Trump nominee John Ring to the National Labor Relations Board last week, giving the board that enforces labor law a 3-2 Republican majority. And former First Lady Barbara Bush has died at the age of 92. She is one of only 2 women in U.S. history to both be the wife of a U.S. president and the mother of another. She has been a champion of literacy and a recent critic of President Trump, who attacked her son, Jeb, who ran against Trump for the Republican Party presidential nomination. Barbara Bush died Tuesday evening at her home in Houston, Texas. From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
We all praise the historic decision by President Trump to recognize Jerusalem as our capital and to move the embassy there of the world's biggest power. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, America.
As Israel begins to mark the 70th anniversary of the country's founding, Israeli troops continue to crack down on Palestinian protests in Gaza. Over the past 3 weeks, Israeli forces have killed 33 Palestinians and wounded nearly 4,300. We'll speak with Palestinian-American professor Rashid Khalidi of Columbia University. Then to Syria.
We're very much aware of the delay that the regime imposed on that delegation, but we are also very much aware of how they have operated in the past to conceal what they have done using chemical weapons. In other words, using the pause after a strike like that to try to clean up the evidence before the investigating team gets in. So it was unfortunate they were delayed.
As UN inspectors attempt to reach the site of an alleged Syrian chemical weapons attack, we look at the escalating crisis in Syria. We'll speak with Mozam Beg, a former Guantanamo prisoner who's traveled to Syria to investigate the U.S. rendition program, as well as speak with former prisoners of the Assad regime. Then we'll look at why America's black mothers and babies are in a life-or-death crisis. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. President Trump said Wednesday he's looking forward to planned talks with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, but said he's prepared to walk away from the table if he's not happy with how they're proceeding. Trump's comments came as U.S. and North Korean officials solidified plans for an unprecedented summit between the two leaders, likely to be held in Mongolia's capital. On Wednesday, Trump took to Twitter to praise his CIA chief, Mike Pompeo, for secretly meeting with Kim Jong-un Easter weekend. The praise was widely seen as a bid to boost Pompeo's bid to become Secretary of State, as the Senate Foreign Relations Committee is poised to reject his nomination. President Trump demurred Wednesday when asked if he was moving to fire special counsel Robert Mueller, even as he called the investigation into alleged ties between the Trump Organization and Russian officials a hoax. Trump was speaking in a joint news conference with the Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe at Trump's Mar-a-Lago resort in Palm Beach, Florida.
This is a hoax. As far as the investigation, nobody has ever been more transparent than I have instructed our lawyers. Be totally transparent. I believe we've given them 1.4 million pages of documents, if you can believe this, and haven't used, that I know of, or for the most part, presidential powers or privilege. So we are hopefully coming to the end. It is a bad thing for our country, very, very bad thing for our country, but there has been no collusion.
Trump's comments came as Iowa Republican Chuck Grassley, the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, said he would move ahead with hearings on bipartisan legislation that would protect special counsel Mueller. The Senate's Republican Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has vowed he will not bring the measure to a vote in the full Senate. This comes as police in at least one major U.S. city are preparing for possible riots if President Trump fires Robert Mueller. A memo from Pittsburgh Police Commander Victor Joseph reads, quote, "Beginning April 19th, all major crimes detectives are required to bring a full uniform and any issued protective equipment, riot gear, with them to work until further notice. We may be needed in the event that there is a large-scale protest." The Senate moved Wednesday to end an Obama-era policy that warns auto lenders against discriminating against people of color by charging them more on auto loans. West Virginia Democrat Joe Manchin joined Republican senators in a 51-47 vote to overrule the policy by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, an agency that's been assailed by Republicans since its creation in 2010. The House is expected to approve the bill and to send it to President Trump for a signature. The rule was adopted after a 2011 report by the Center for Responsible Lending found African Americans and Latinos disproportionately receive interest rate markups more frequently and to a greater degree than their white counterparts. The Senate's approved a rule change that will allow nursing mothers to bring infants to the Senate floor during votes and to breastfeed them inside the chamber. The rule change comes after Illinois Democratic Senator Tammy Duckworth became the first U.S. senator to give birth while in office. Duckworth has not been present in Senate votes since the birth of her daughter, Miley Pearl Bowlesby, earlier this month. In Puerto Rico, most of the island's 1.4 million residents are without power after an excavator downed a transmission line Wednesday, blacking out the entire electrical grid for the U.S. territory. The latest blackout comes after hundreds of thousands of residents went for months without power in the wake of Hurricane Maria last fall, and less than a week after another blackout left more than 800,000 Puerto Ricans temporarily without electricity. In Syria, a UN security team with the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons has delayed its inquiry into an alleged chemical weapons attack in Douma after members of the team were shot at by unknown assailants as they approached the site. The latest delay to the inspectors' mission came amidst competing claims about whether chemical weapons were to blame for the deaths of at least 40 people in the Damascus suburb of Douma on April 7th and over who was responsible. President Trump cited the alleged attack as his rationale for a coordinated U.S., British, and French attack on Syria last Friday. We'll have more on Syria after headlines with Columbia University professor Rashid Khalidi and Mozambique. In the Israeli-occupied West Bank, press freedom groups are expressing alarm over the arrest of a journalist early Wednesday by Palestinian security forces. Relatives say the officers presented a search warrant and arrested Hazem Nasser without mention of what charge he's being held on. Nasser works for the Naja broadcasting channel, which frequently covers Israel's demolition of Palestinian homes, the arrests of Palestinians, and the condition of Palestinians held in Israeli prisons. In a statement, the Committee to Protect Journalists said, quote, "The authorities must explain immediately on what grounds they snatched this journalist away from his home in the middle of the night." In Cuba, President Raul Castro is stepping down today and will hand power to his hand-picked successor, Miguel Díaz-Canel. Castro will remain head of Cuba's ruling Communist Party. The 57-year-old Díaz-Canel comes to power as the Trump administration seeks to reverse a thaw in relations between the U.S. and Cuba begun under President Barack Obama. In Kansas, a federal jury convicted 3 white male militia members Wednesday of plotting to massacre Somali immigrants at a mosque and an apartment building in Garden City. Gavin Wright, Patrick Stein, and Curtis Allen were found guilty of conspiracy to use a weapon of mass destruction after an FBI informant said they were plotting to use guns and car bombs to mass murder Somalis. The 3 belonged to a militia called the Crusaders. At trial, their lawyer admitted the trio referred to Muslims as cockroaches, but argued they hadn't meant to go through with their plot. In Minnesota, an FBI whistleblower who leaked classified information about how the Bureau aggressively targets potential informants pleaded guilty Tuesday to charges of unauthorized disclosure. Terry J. Albury, who was the only African-American agent at the FBI's field office in Minneapolis, called his leaks an act of conscience aimed at calling out racism at the Bureau. He faces up to 10 years in prison, but is likely to receive less than 5 under a plea deal. In Georgia, immigrants imprisoned at a for-profit detention center have filed a class-action lawsuit claiming they were forced to work for $8 a day or less in violation of U.S. labor law. The suit alleges prisoners at the Stewart Detention Center in Lumpkin, Georgia, who refused to join so-called voluntary work programs face retaliation by guards, including threats of criminal prosecution. One former prisoner says he worked 8-hour shifts in the prison's kitchen extension for up to 7 days per week, earning just $4 per day. He says when he refused to work, he was put in solitary confinement for 10 days. The prison is operated by Core Civic, formerly known as Corrections Corporation of America. New York State will restore voting rights to thousands of felons on parole under an executive order signed by Governor Andrew Cuomo Wednesday. Civil rights lawyer Myrna Perez of the Brennan Center for Justice welcomed the order, writing in a statement, quote, "New York State's disenfranchisement policy is rooted in historical racism, a shameful extension of 19th century efforts to intentionally block black men from casting ballots, and today depriving Americans on parole of the right to vote continues to have a drastic impact on the people of color," she wrote. In Poland, environmentalists are celebrating after Europe's highest court ordered an immediate halt to large-scale logging in one of the continent's last pristine forests. Tuesday's ruling by the European Union Court of Justice found Poland violated European Union laws by allowing as many as 100,000 ancient trees to be logged in the Białowieża forest. Following the ruling, Greenpeace and other forest protectors have demanded Poland's government drop charges against 300 activists arrested during protests against the illegal logging. In Great Britain, protesters blocked entry to Canada's main embassy in London Wednesday, erecting a mock oil pipeline marked with the words Trudeau Oil. The protest came as Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau arrived in London for talks with Prime Minister Theresa May. The demonstrators want Trudeau to end his support for an expansion of the Trans Mountain Pipeline, which would accelerate oil shipments from Canada's tar sands region to a terminal near Vancouver. This is UK Greenpeace Program Director Pat Venditti.
Tar sands oil is amongst the dirtiest fossil fuels on the planet. It's dirtier than coal. And Prime Minister Trudeau is here in London to talk about climate responsibility. And our message to Mr. Trudeau is that climate leaders don't build pipelines.
Nosso programa fica por aqui. Você pode acompanhar a gente pela página do Facebook e pelo blog do GECI Terra em Transe. Nos vemos na próxima semana. Até lá!